And with that, I would like to please welcome to the stage Dr. Paul Beck, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at The Ohio State University. Please help me welcome.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm really glad to be here. I am a former Worthington resident, so I've come home. We moved in November to a different place, Upper Arlington, if you can imagine that. It's really been hard to adjust to, but you do what you can. I still root for the Worthington schools when they come to play Upper Arlington, so I haven't lost that connection. Doing a preview of the general election, which is my topic today, is a difficult task in many ways because so much can change between now and early voting in October or even the November election itself. And if you think back in time, a lot has already changed this year. You have to go back to February when Hamas invaded Israel and the kind of turmoil that's created not only in that part of the world, but also here at home, including on my campus at Ohio State University. And those kinds of events can very much affect particularly a presidential race. I'm a child of the 1960s, and I remember the protests in the 1960s that very much affected that race. And in fact, I think that Nixon would not have won the presidency had it not been for those protests. And he managed of that situation, as Republicans will try to do today. It's politics, and these things indeed happen. So there's that going on. There, of course, is the war in Ukraine, with changes that could be impactful for the presidential races as well, presidential race as well as congressional races. There's the state of the economy. We'll have to see how that plays out over time. We also have two candidates that share at least two different traits. One of them is that they are the oldest of them have some health problems, and it could well be that those health problems would impact on their presidential nomination itself before the conventions in July and in August. One of them, I'm told, also faces considerable scrutiny in the courtroom, and that also could affect the nature of the contest. And then there'll be all these things that we don't even anticipate between now and the presidential election itself. So again, I'm speaking tentatively today. A lot could happen to change even the mildest of predictions that I make, and I apologize for that in advance. What I'd like to do is start out by simply reviewing the landscape that's in front of us. And I will do that if I can. Yep, there we go. Okay. We obviously have contests for federal offices, starting with the presidency that is really kind of capturing most of our attention, quite obviously. It's Biden versus Trump, but they're not the only players on the stage. There are three candidates in particular. There'll be more than three other candidates, but three of them have gotten a lot of attention recently. One, of course, is Robert Kennedy Jr., who is running as an independent. His challenge, by the way, is to be able to qualify for the ballot in the 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And that's not easy to do. It requires a lot of money, which I think he has, but also a lot of organizational ability to be able to get the kinds of signatures, the number of signatures that you need to get on the ballot. I've kind of lost count of where he is now, but I think he is qualified in 5 states. It may be more than that in the very near future. And then there also is Cornel West, who is running as an independent, more on the left. Kennedy's really not on the left. I don't know where he is in some of his positioning. But West also, she already qualifies for the ballot because when it's an established political party, which the Green Party is, you are able to get on the ballot for the next election based on the percentage of votes that you got in the previous contest. And the Greens got enough votes in the 2000 contest to be able to qualify for the ballot. Now, the importance of those three others, and the reasons I have dwelled on them, is that they could be spoilers. In a very close presidential contest, it could be that one or the other of them, or the three of them in total, will deny somebody the plurality that that candidate needs to win the Electoral College vote in a particular state. Okay, so that's the presidency, and I'll say more about that later on. And then there are contests for the United States Senate. Currently, as we all know from watching the news, there are 48 Democrats in the Senate, plus 3 people who are independents, but who nonetheless caucus with the Democrats. So that's the Democratic majority of 51 seats. There are 49 Republicans. That's a pretty narrow margin. Not enough Democrats to be able to overcome a filibuster unless they get Republican votes, which they don't often do, to try to end a filibuster. So it's a very, very almost even Senate. There are 33 seats that are up right now for 6-year terms. And then there are 2 more that are short-term seats to fill the Senate seats that have been vacated, and those seats will be filled in one case this November, but in another case in another year. So some states will experience two contests. Those are California and Nebraska, and that's that first congressional district, or excuse me, it's a Senate district there. 4 of those seats are competitive. All the rest are either safe or lean very much in the direction favoring one party or another. Those 4 are all seats that are held by Democrats. Arizona, Sinema now classifies herself as an independent, but she has caucused with the Democrats. That seat is open. And then there are seats for re-election of Democrats in Nevada, in Montana, and in Ohio. And so those are going to be the targeted seats for the 2024 campaign. 24 are safe seats. You could almost mail in the result right now, at least based on the primary election. And the other thing I should say, by the way, that for the Senate and the House of Representatives, not all of the primaries have been held yet. There are still some people yet to be nominated as their party's candidates for those offices. But as I said, there are 24 safe seats. Democrats hold 14, Republicans hold 10, but the real fight is going to be over those 4 competitive seats. In the U.S. House of Representatives, there are, of course, 435 seats. These are all 2-year seats. Currently, they are held by 213 Democrats, 218 Republicans, and 4 seats that were held by Republicans right now are vacant. So again, it's a very, very tight margin that the Republicans enjoy in the House of Representatives. And of course, we've seen that in terms of the battles over the speakership and over what the speaker is going to do in terms of advancing legislation. Of those 435 seats, the various analysts, and I use the Cook Political Report primarily, and will as I move along here, only 22 of them are really competitive. That means 5% of the House of Representatives is going to be determined in races that are not easily won by one party or another. 5%. And you can imagine what kind of money is going to be invested in those races. And if you have the misfortune of living in one of those districts, you're going to, every time you turn on your TV set, see all kinds of ads, most of them not very pleasant ads. Most of those ads, by the way, run by political action committees that are not affiliated with the candidates. So they can be even nastier and dirtier than the candidate ads are likely to be. 84% of all of these House seats are safe. Again, you could write in the result. Once the nominee is known, if it's a Republican or Democrat in a safe seat, you know that they're going to win the general election. Okay, let me make some observations beyond those that I've already made about this landscape. One is that turnout will be important, as it always is. Turnout nationwide in 2020 was 66%. Now, 66% is of registered voters. There are another, if I do my math right, and there is a mathematician in the crowd who will check me on this, there's another 34% who are not registered voters. Some states, by the way, don't have registration. Other states do. Ohio, of course, does. Here, by the way, we have an odd system of registration, and that is that you are registered with the party in whose primary you have last voted. If you don't vote in the primary, and a majority of Ohioans do not, then you are classified as unaffiliated. And you can show up at the polling place and request the ballot of either party and be able to vote in that party's primary. I used to say some years ago that you could be challenged, and that may still be a possibility. But one of the students in my class, when I made that comment, raised her hand and she said, I work at the polls. Nobody ever challenges anybody. And others are kind of nodding their heads, not that they would know because they were 18 and 19 years old. So they didn't have the kind of experience that she had. But anyway, turnout will be really important. And we are seeing, I think early on at least, an election in which, at least at the presidential level, there's very little enthusiasm for either candidate. The second thing I wanted to mention that the two presidential candidates, major party candidates, share is that they are the two most unpopular presidential candidates we have had in my lifetime. When I used to make that comment, I wasn't really talking about a lot of years. Now I am. And that could dull the enthusiasm that people will have for actually voting. And it's the presidential contest that draws voters to the polls, not really the other contests, although on occasion sometimes it does. The candidates for president need to be nominated by their conventions. Those were in July for the Republicans, in August for the Democrats. As we know, if you pay attention to the news here in Ohio, Biden possibly could not be on the ballot. I think he will be on the ballot in Ohio, but the Republicans may not be inclined to do him a favor by either excluding 2024 from the requirements or making some other way possible for Biden to get onto the ballot. As I said before, it's going to be a very tight race. At least according to the polls that we've seen in recent days, and I'll come back to the polls towards the end of my talk. It's important to realize, and I think we tend to forget about this, or at least the media coverage tends to forget about it, that it's an Electoral College majority that is required to win the presidency. And that boils down to, this year, probably 7 states, just 7 states. The other states, again, you can write home or write in the outcome. But the 7 states I've listed there on the screen: Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, which is the only one of them that was won by Trump in 2020, Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. If you own a television station in those states, you're going to have a great time of it, because there'll be all kinds of money spent by the presidential campaigns to try to advance the candidacy of their particular nominee. If, on the other hand, you live in a state that is not a competitive state, you won't see many TV ads unless you're watching the news and they're showing you what's going on in other states. I had a friend, by the way, who came to visit me from Massachusetts some years ago during the presidential election campaign. And he said, it's so great to be in Ohio, because Ohio is a swing state. And I'm getting to see all of these ads for the 2 candidates. He was here 3 or 4 days, and on the 4th day he said, I'll be so glad to get back to Massachusetts. I'm so tired of seeing the same ad pounding over and over again on the negative features of a particular candidate. And he went back to Massachusetts and lived quietly for the rest of the campaign. But again, a majority of the Electoral College is 270 votes. A candidate has to win 270 or more to be elected as president. If there is a tie, or if nobody achieves that majority, then, as we know from focusing on 2020, the election is decided in the House of Representatives, with each state having one vote. And if the House remains the same as it is right now, that would mean that there would be a Republican majority in the House of Representatives. So the Electoral College is how do I want to say it? It's the result of a constitutional bargain. It's understandable why that bargain was struck. I personally don't think it's worked very well over the years, but of course you have to amend the Constitution to be able to change it, and that's really not very easy to do. I've been invited, by the way, to give what's called a last lecture by an organization actually here in Worthington. And one of the things I think I'll talk about is what electoral reforms I would like to see. And one of them would be getting rid of the Electoral College and going towards a popular vote in terms of who gets elected president. But again, that's not going to happen. That's wishful thinking on my part. For the congressional races, as I said before, we're talking about 4 seats, basically, at the Senate level, that's going to determine control of the Senate going forward from 2025 on. House control depends on those 22 competitive House seats. Again, only 22 seats out of 435. That's an incredibly small amount of seats. National money will be invested in those contests, and it'll be millions and millions of dollars will go in that direction. Gerrymandering factors in to some of the House contests. Gerrymandering has really benefited one of the parties in 9 states, mostly the Republicans. We see this in Ohio, obviously, and I'll come back to this later on and talk about it. In 2 states, gerrymandering has benefited incumbents of both parties. And you could see it a bit in Ohio with the last deal that was struck in terms of redistricting. The Democratic leaders were determined that they would protect the seats of incumbent Democrats. There just weren't many of them, many of those seats anyway. So incumbents have a vested interest in trying to protect their seats, and sometimes they're quite willing to give up control of a chamber just as long as they themselves are protected. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, it'll switch, I think, in a minute. Wayne, can you switch that for me? No. Next one. Yeah, there we go. Okay, I wanted to talk about state contests beyond the federal level. There aren't many contests for governor this year. Governors are typically elected in the off years or the midterms. Sometimes they're really an off year. There's one toss-up race, it appears, and that's in New Hampshire. Governor Sununu is not going to be running again, and that seat could be won, or that state house could be won by a Democrat, but it's really a toss-up. 8 of them are safe, 2 by incumbent Republicans, 1 Democratic open seat that's surely going to be won by a Democrat, 5 Republican open seats that are almost surely going to be won by a Republican. State legislatures, this is the year of state legislatures. 78% of all the state legislative seats are going to be decided this year. 21, well, let me backtrack for a minute. Some of the primaries have already been held to nominate candidates for those seats. 21 incumbents were defeated in those primaries, 16 of them Republicans. Typically, more or less mainstream Republicans who were defeated by a MAGA or a Donald Trump endorsed Republican candidate. This is less than was the case in 2022. It's more than was the case in 2020, but the year's not over yet. There's still primaries that are going to be held in some of these states. In 2022, 24% of the seats were open. 41% of the state legislative seats were safe. The rest were kind of in the middle. They leaned in one direction or another. 27% of incumbents faced a competitive primary. So again, just to give you kind of a feel for what's going on at the state legislative level. Not a lot of attention gets focused on state legislative races. If you're like I am, sometimes I go into the ballot box and I'm faced with choices for the state legislative contests that are in my districts, and I'm basically saying, who are these people? And what tends to happen, and what's happened more and more in recent years, is that people vote their party for those offices because that's the information they have. Or if they're Trump followers, they follow his endorsement and vote for candidates who have been endorsed by him, which is why the endorsement is so valuable to Republican candidates for the state legislature. There are also what are called trifectas, and this is important for policy in the states. A trifecta is when the governor's office and the two houses of the legislature, if there are two houses, Nebraska only has one, but everybody else has two. It's where the two houses of the legislature and the governor's seat are controlled by one party. It makes it easy for that particular party to get its legislation passed, unless it's divided as it is in some states. Ohio being one of them, by the way, which has been very interesting in the last couple of years. There are 23 Republican trifectas right now, 17 Democratic trifectas. 10 of these states are divided in terms of who controls what. And so there's more negotiation that tends to take place in those states when it comes to passing legislation than there is in the state where one party controls virtually everything. There also are ballot measures that are worth paying attention to, and will probably get a lot of attention as time goes forward. There are measures on the ballot already qualified in Florida, in Maryland, and in New York. And those are all pro-abortion measures. There are 14 that are proposed, which means that the people who want to put that particular issue on the ballot are trying to gather signatures right now and qualify for the ballot. Most of them, I think, will, but it's not certain that they will, and there may be obstacles thrown in their way to prevent them from qualifying. 9 of these are pro-abortion. 5 of them are initiatives to amend the state constitution to ban abortions. Some of them to ban them in a very, very strong way. So stay tuned in terms of these issues that are going to be on the ballot. Okay, let me turn to Ohio now. And we have a competitive U.S. Senate race, very competitive, one in which Sherrod Brown, who is probably familiar to everybody here because he's been the senator now for 3 terms, is facing a strong opponent in Bernie Moreno, who has the Trump endorsement, who needed the Trump endorsement, by the way, to be able to win the Republican primary. And that endorsement was worth, depending on how you calculate it, maybe 20 points for him. It elevated him even more than the Trump endorsement elevated J.D. Vance back in 2022. It's worth pointing out that, and again, I think the media misleads us in a way here. They talk about Trump having won Ohio by 8%, both in 2016 and in 2020. But he only won it by 51 to 53% in those 2 years. Bare majorities. If one or the other of the candidates doesn't get a majority, the other one will win because there are only two candidates running, at least as far as I could tell, for this Senate seat. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Is Ohio a Republican state now? I'll raise this question again later on, but it seems to me that one needs to distinguish between Ohio being a pro-Trump state and whether Ohio will remain a Republican state if Trump is no longer on the ballot or no longer a force within his party. So we'll see what happens. In the state, or in the U.S. House and state legislative race, Ohio, as I mentioned before, is heavily gerrymandered when it comes to legislative contests. Now that Wisconsin has redistricted, I think Ohio probably is the most gerrymandered state in the country. 53 to 54% of the vote went Republican in recent years. That enabled the Republicans to win 2/3 of the House districts, U.S. House districts, 68% of the state House districts, 9% of the state Senate districts. There's something wrong there in terms of the translation of votes into seats, and it's really the product of a gerrymander. And of course, once a gerrymander is in place, what it's doing is electing incumbents, and incumbents have an advantage in these particularly state legislative races because they're better known, they can attract more money, and they have an advantage that carries on beyond what the normal party breakdown would be in that particular district. For Congress, there are really only two competitive seats right now. One is in the 9th District that runs up along Lake Erie from, I think, just west of Toledo all the way to the, almost to the Cleveland suburbs. Marcy Kaptur is the U.S. House member from that district. She has been the representative from that district for many terms. She drew a particularly strong opponent, Derek Marin, who was a former member of the state legislature, who for a while, maybe a month, I'm thinking, was the designated speaker of the lower house, and then he was displaced or dethroned, if you want to put it that way, by kind of a revolt among Republicans and Democrats in the state house. But he's going to be a strong opponent for her. A lot of money is going to be spent on that particular race. The other one is Amelia Sykes in the 13th Congressional District. She is the incumbent representative in that district. Kevin Coughlin, who was a former state legislator in Ohio maybe 10 years ago or so, maybe even longer than that, is running against her. It's a competitive district. Sykes, I think, as an incumbent, probably has an edge there, but you can bet that a lot of money is going to be invested in trying to defeat her. One thing that has been interesting to me is that the first congressional district in Ohio, was one that the map makers, the Republican map makers, had basically thought was going to end up being a pro-Republican district. Didn't turn out that way, and now they're not investing in the opponent to the Democratic congressman from that district, which means they have pretty much written it off. Interesting to me. Now, whether they could begin investing as things get closer to the election or not, we'll see. But it doesn't look like they're going to. And so it's going to boil down in terms of House races, in U.S. House races in Ohio, to those two districts. The 9th with Marcy Kaptur, the 13th with Amelia Sykes and their Republican opponents. For the state legislature, there are 14 House districts out of 99 that are competitive. 10 of those are pro-democratic. And so the Republicans have a prospect of being able to gain seats there. They may not be able to do that. It really depends upon what happens between now and November. And turn out at the top of the ticket for president, as well as maybe votes for senator. There are two open seats in Franklin County. One of them is Grove City, kind of southwestern Columbus. The other one is on the west side, west suburbs, Dublin and Hilliard. Those two seats are open. I think probably will be won by Democrats, but we can't be sure of that. The Senate likely is to be more conservative, mainly because only half the seats are at stake in the 2024 contest. But the Democrats may pick up some state house districts. I think they have a fighting chance to do that. Would I bet on it? Maybe not. But it really depends upon what's going to happen between now and then. One of the interesting things that is going on the Republican side in the state house. Stevens is currently the Speaker of the House. He is a Republican, conservative Republican, who was elected with more Democratic votes than Republican votes. Derek Merrin was the House member who was designated as the Speaker early on, and then there was kind of a revolt against him, and Democrats and Republicans came together to vote in Stevens as Speaker. Well, what's interesting about this particular contest going forward is that Matt Huffman, who is currently a member of the Senate, the President of the Senate, is term limited. He's from Lima, so he is running for a House district in the Lima area. It's a safe Republican district, so he's going to win that election. And he wants to be Speaker of the House of Representatives, the State House of Representatives. And so he's trying to line up votes to elect him as Speaker. Now, he's not going to get any Democratic votes, but if he can get most of the Republican votes, he indeed could become Speaker as of 2025. So there's going to be a lot of drama there. A lot of money is going to be spent. A lot of money was spent trying to defeat the 22 Republicans, or really 17 Republicans who were running for re-election, who had voted for Stevens over Merrin back in 2023. Of those 17, 11 were re-elected. I don't think any of them are going to end up voting for Huffman, but you can bet he's trying to persuade them, maybe persuade is too soft a term, to vote for him as Speaker. And so the real action is going to be with those 11 to see what happens with them over time. Again, a lot of money is going to be spent there. It already has been. One of the battles that's been going on within the Republican Party is who controls the party funds in the State House. They right now are controlled by Stevens, who is the Speaker of the House. But the anti-Stevens forces have said, no, that's not fair. They should be controlled by a majority of Republicans in the House, the Republican caucus. And so there's this fight over where these hundreds of thousands of dollars are going to be spent or invested. A lot of that's already been spent. It was already spent in the primaries, but some will be spent in the general election itself. Okay, so where am I? Well, Stevens, I've talked about. The blue 22, by the way, are the 22 Republicans back in 2023 who voted with Democrats to be able to elect Stevens as the Speaker of the House. They were condemned by the Republican State Committee. I think the State Committee has kind of backed off that condemnation of them right now, maybe hoping that they will allow Matt Huffman to get to them and convert them into Huffman voters for Speaker. The other thing is, by the way, part of this, and I think it's a really interesting dynamic, by the way, totally an internal dynamic within the Republican Party, at least for right now, is that there are a lot of Republican House members who deeply resent a president of the Senate coming crashing into the House and immediately becoming Speaker. They've always felt, at least these people, that the Senate kind of lords it over the House. And so they seem not to be willing to give Huffman the kind of votes he's going to need to be Speaker. But again, that game is going to continue to be played. It'll be mostly behind the scenes. It'll be hard to really figure out just exactly what is going on there. What you need to do is watch the money. to see where the money is going. But of course, you can't watch all of the money because some of it is secret dark money that will be invested in various candidates and spent on behalf of their campaigns. Okay, also on the ballot in November is going to be a redistricting reform issue or initiative, again, to try to get away from gerrymandering, to prevent it from happening by installing an independent commission that would actually make the decisions in terms of drawing district lines. Based on past votes, I think it has a very good chance of passing. And it will only take a majority to amend the state constitution to put that into place. Republicans had hoped that they could increase that threshold to 60%, and there was a ballot initiative in 2023 to do just that. It failed by a considerable margin. I think most Ohioans actually are tired of the games that are played with gerrymandering and would rather see it taken out of the hands of state legislators, or the majority party really in the state legislature, and some of the statewide officials, and try an independent commission with also some stipulation as to what standards ought to be applied in doing that particular redistricting. So we'll see what happens in the November contest when it comes to the independent commission reform. There's some issues that are on the stage, I think, for this election, and it'll be interesting to see how much they come into play. One of them that is surely going to be important in these contests for the state legislature and for the U.S. Senate and House is the issue of abortion. And again, Ohioans have spoken on that issue. There's an attempt to basically fold that back by the legislature. I'm not sure they know quite what they can do to deny the effect of a state constitutional amendment, but they're nonetheless going to try to do that, it seems to me, and it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds over time. But abortion is going to be an important issue, as it is in many other states. A second issue is going to be redistricting reform. It's going to be on the ballot, as I just said, for the 2024 November contest. It's going to draw some voters to the polls who are there just for that issue, to be able to vote on that issue on one side or the other, but probably more on the pro-reform side than the anti-reform side. And that could affect the outcome as well. And then there's a third issue kind of laying there in the background. And that's the issue of corruption. It's the first energy issue. 2 people already have been jailed for that or found guilty for that. 2 suicides are connected with that issue. It has been described by many as the greatest corruption scandal ever in the state of Ohio, and one of the greatest ever in the country. I keep thinking that that issue is going to come to play in legislative contests in particular. It really hasn't yet in previous years. Part of the reason for that is that some Democrats had voted for Larry Householder for Speaker some years ago, and had voted for the first energy legislation that it wanted to pass to protect its rates and protect its holdings. And so it was kind of hard for the Democrats, I think, to aim their ammunition at this scandal and try to play it up. Most of those members of the legislature are gone. And it may well be that 2024 is the year where the Democrats will campaign on that issue and try to make that a voting issue for a lot of voters. They have a problem, by the way, and that is that the Democrats will have much less money to spend this year in the campaigns than the Republicans will. That's been the case in recent years, and it will continue, I think, to be the case in 2024. And if voters get their signals from watching television commercials, that matters. And it particularly matters for these down ballot races where voters don't really know much about the candidates. And so, stand by with your remote, ready to change the channel if you see a campaign ad that you're not particularly attracted to. But there's going to be a lot of that. It will enrich the TV stations. I, some years ago, by the way, worked for Channel 4 here in Ohio as an analyst, and they were just delighted by the kind of contest that was going on that year. This was a couple of presidential campaigns ago, because it meant more money in their coffers. They particularly like presidential spending because it's mostly political action committees that are spending the money, and they have to pay the full rate for ads. Candidates get a discount. And so they don't really like to have candidate ads. They would much rather have political action committee ads and these kind of dark money ads. And the marketing people were just gleeful over what was going to happen to their bottom line. That's why they were willing to pay me some money to be an advisor to them. They didn't get their money's worth, by the way, but that's another matter, and didn't hire me again. But it, again, is going to be something that's going to fill the airways. But of course, the world has changed in terms of media. We now have moved from broadcast news that most of you are familiar with from decades ago, when there were, 3 channels, or maybe not even 3, depending on the market that you were in, who were pretty much presenting the same national news. We now are in an era of narrowcasting, where there are all these cable channels, where voters can kind of pick and choose where they get their news. Many voters, particularly young voters, don't even get their news from cable. They get their news through social media. And they are paying attention to the snippets of news that they see on social media itself. So it's a very, very different world than it used to be, and a world that I think has imminent, has, I was going to say ominous, and maybe I should say ominous, implications for what goes forward. Turnout, whoops, I moved too quickly. Well, I'll just state it. Turnout will matter in Ohio. The turnout rate in Ohio back in 2020 was 74% of registered voters. 3/4 of Ohioans are registered voters. 1/4 are not. And so you can take that 74% and kind of whittle it down to a lower rate of turnout in Ohio than the 74%. And you have to begin thinking, particularly if you are working for a campaign, how can you get those voters registered, particularly voters who will vote for your candidates, in time for the fall election? And that effort is going on right now. And registration is important. I think that it's been made harder for people to register in Ohio than it was just a few years ago. Ohio kind of opened up registration, made it easier during the pandemic for really good reasons, because it was hard for people to get to the polls during the pandemic. And many of those reforms, or those, I won't call them reforms because they were temporary, many of those temporary measures now have been rescinded, and it's now harder for people to register and harder for people to vote in Ohio than it was just a few years ago. Okay, I think that maybe I should pause right now and give you a chance to take a break for perhaps 5 minutes or so, and then we'll come back to talk about polling and campaign spending and some other things as well. So come back at, probably 1:55? Okay, are you ready to talk about polling? I think I am, so maybe that's what's important here. We, the public, find out about campaigns in 2 ways. One is through expenditures of money, campaign funds, that get reported in the media, because in various states, as well as for federal contests with the Federal Election Commission, they have deadlines where they have to report on what's been contributed and how they've spent that money. And so the media, understandably, grabs those reports, takes a look at them, tries to see what that tells them about a particular contest, either for president or some of the down ballot contests. So following the money is important. The problem is that not all of the money gets reported. There is what is so-called dark money. This is money that is basically sent to a 501c4 or 503c4. The donors don't have to be reported. And the money itself sometimes is kind of hidden from sight. And then what these organizations do is they turn around and contribute money, typically to political action committees, that also don't have to divulge where the money has come from, at least originally. And so it means that it's very murky to try to figure out how much money is being spent. And more money these days is being spent as dark money than is being spent by the candidate campaigns. And it's because the candidate campaigns for federal offices and state offices as well have limits on how much any individual can contribute and how much they can spend. Whereas the dark money's sources have no limits whatsoever. So it makes it really hard to use campaign spending, campaign donations as some kind of a window on what's going on with a campaign. The other thing that we rely on heavily, and the media relies on heavily, again, understandably, are public opinion polls. And it is estimated that there will be 1,500 polls conducted in 2024 for presidential and federal contests for Senate and for the House, as well as for gubernatorial contests. And there'll be other polls that are private polls conducted on behalf of particular candidates. And if the results are favorable, they leak these, they somehow get out to the media, but they really are pre-cooked to present a particular result and a favorable result. And so we will be awash in polls. And that is basically how we try to figure out what is going to happen in the general election itself. The federal money race, by the way, I just picked up some figures from the April 17th reports to the Federal Election Commission, and this is for federal contests only. Money donated for candidates was $483 million. Money donated to PACs was $568 million. That excludes, as I said before, dark money. I don't know how you figure this, but 483 million and 568 million strike me as a lot of money. A lot of money swimming into these campaigns. And it's money that is, again, going to enrich the TV stations in competitive areas. In the states that I've talked about for president, the 7 that are going to be battleground states, as well as various districts for the U.S. House of Representatives. And then the money kind of filters down to bottom of the ballot contests as well, and those usually have different spending limits. I've no longer paid attention to what the Ohio limits are, but they're considerably higher than the limits at the federal level. So people can spend more money, donate more money to candidates and PACs in Ohio. And of course, they can also use the dark money route. I'm reminded, by the way, as I talk about this, that the Koch organization, Americans for Progress, had spent, I think it was almost $100,000 to try to influence the Upper Arlington School Board race a few years ago. And I don't know exactly why they did this, but I found out about it because one of my students was working for them, and I said, well, now why did you choose them to work for? And he said, they pay better than anybody else. And so they had targeted that race. I think it was really over issues of school levies and taxes, which they were opposing. But anyway, this money is filtered down to the localist of levels, and it's important to understand that. Well, what should you look for in polls? How do you make sense of all of this? The 6 best polls, as designated by 538, and that's the Nate Silver organization. He ranked, or his organization ranked, 518 pollsters for their historical accuracy, how accurate they had been in predicting election outcomes, and for what they call methodological transparency. Some of these pollsters don't tell you how they've conducted the poll. They may be interviewing only Republicans or only Democrats, probably not. Some of the ones that are pretty accurate, by the way, don't ever tell you what method they use for trying to contact potential voters and getting their preferences. But what 538 did was said, well, okay, we're going to evaluate each one of these polls, and we're going to give grades to them. And of the top 30 polls, there were 3 that, there we go. There were 3 that had an A+ rating, very dependable polls. They're polls, by the way, that I pay a lot of attention to because I have great confidence in them. One is the New York Times Siena College poll that's done quite regularly, both nationally and in some of the battleground states. The second one is the Seltzer poll, which is done mainly in Ohio, and she's been doing polling there for decades, and those polls are very accurate as a picture of what's going to happen in the Iowa caucuses particularly. And caucuses are very hard to poll because you don't really know who's going to turn up at these caucus meetings. And then the third one is Survey USA, that also is given an A+ rating by 538. And then there are 3 that merit an A rating, and that is ABC, Washington Post, that is Monmouth College, and Siena College, both of which have polling operations and have in many ways made a name for themselves as a college. Good advertising to be able to conduct your own poll and get the media to report on its results. So if you have to pick among the array of polls that are thrown at you virtually every day, pay most attention to these. And then the other thing to pay attention to is if a poll is giving results that are outliers, that don't really match up to what you're hearing about other polls, discount that poll and wait to see what other polls are doing and kind of use an average there. Real Clear Politics, by the way, is one of the sites that reports on polls, both at the state level and at the national level. And they give you an average. And it's a very useful average because it kind of weeds out, in doing the average, the ones that are extreme in their results. And that can happen because a poll obviously is sampling voters. The hidden secret, by the way, in the polling industry these days is that almost no Americans will respond to a poll. Now that it's easy to move a call to voicemail and pay no attention to it, or to just say no and hang up the phone, or just if they're knocking on your door, just not to open the door. The rates of response to these polls now is less than 10% of the potential sample. And that's a real problem for pollsters. I've been in that business since I was in graduate school. And when I was in graduate school, the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan, where I got a lot of my training, was getting response rates that are between 70 and 80%. Face-to-face, door-to-door. They now are getting response rates that are below 10%. And they try to correct for that by various procedures for weighting respondents, WEIGHTING respondents, so that they correspond to the demographics of the electorate. But that's always a very chancy thing to do because you never know if you got it right. And in fact, there's one great example of that in 2016, most of the pollsters were basically underestimating the Trump vote in this country. And it was because Trump voters were doing very well Trump was doing very well among lower educated voters. who were not represented as much as they should have been in the samples that were drawn by these polling firms. And so they overcorrected for that in 2020 and pretty much got it wrong on the other side. And so it's a very chancy kind of thing to do. And yet, having said all of that, I'm always amazed at how most of these polls are pretty darn accurate when it comes to estimating what the outcome of the election is. Back when I was at another university, ran a polling operation there, and we were doing a statewide poll on the gubernatorial race. And Bob Graham was the Republican governor at the time. And we issued a news report that showed that he might lose the election. And then one day I'm sitting kind of quietly in my office, and I get this phone call. And the woman at the other end said, "Stand by for the governor of the state." And I thought, oh boy, yeah, he wants to consult with me. Well, he reamed me out for that poll, saying it's not what our polls are showing. And he won by a huge margin, by the way. So our poll was clearly off base there. And it's always a danger you run if you're doing polling. And I think it's particularly a danger these days. But again, to come to kind of the bottom line for you as consumers of polls is make sure you do some kind of mental averaging of the polls. Make sure you pay attention to what the timing of the poll was. A lot can happen in a week or two to change the dynamic of a race, and be aware of that. Make sure you are factoring out extreme results. There's some results that you might like a lot. Don't dwell on them too much, because they could be wrong, and you will have engaged in wishful thinking. There are some poll results you don't like at all. Stay tuned. They may get better over time. But anyway, the important thing to realize is that's how we know what's going on in this horse race, either for a contest like the Brown contest for the U.S. Senate, or the contest for president between Biden and Trump. Okay. Let me now come to kind of a conclusion here. And I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, so I'm going to go fairly quickly through that. And I state these as questions, as uncertainties, which is why they each have a question mark. One is, and it doesn't have a question mark, I'm certain about this, the national contest for president, for House and Senate at the federal level are going to be very close. And up until the very end, I think we are not going to know who the presidential winner is, particularly because of the Electoral College. And we're not going to know who is going to control either the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate. Very, very close contests. Another imponderable, and here I do have a question mark, is how the candidates' health or their legal troubles may affect the presidential race. As I said at the outset, these two candidates are the oldest candidates for president we've ever had. Now I'm in their age range. I understand the kind of frailties that there are associated with being in your late 70s or early 80s. And something could happen immediately that would all of a sudden change the nature of that race. A candidate could stumble coming down the steps of Air Force One, or confuse opponents at one of his rallies. There are indicators that both of these candidates have the kinds of things that we've grown accustomed to for people who are elderly. Doesn't mean they can't be a successful president or an effective president, but it's reasons to worry about health. The conventions could choose somebody else. They're not going to unless something untoward happens to their candidate, because both Biden and Trump now have enough delegates in their pockets to be able to win the nomination. And unless something really extreme would happen to one or the other or both of them, they are indeed going to be the nominees going into the fall contest. Another thing to think about is how much the contest at the top of the ballot, the contest for president, will affect the down ballot races. Will people who see, having paid attention to the polls, the one candidate or the other is likely to win the presidency, will they conclude, well, I don't really know much about candidates down ballot, I'm just not going to vote? And if there is a differential in enthusiasm and in turnout for those down ballot races, or even for the races at the top of the ballot, that could affect the results. The Ohio results in 2024, based on past experience, are likely to be pro-Republican. Sherrod Brown has really been the only successful statewide candidate in the very recent years. And he may be successful again in 2024, but he's going to be in the fight of his life in terms of being able to win that Senate seat. Will the state House Republican margin be narrowed? I think it could be, but again, it depends on a lot of what's going to happen between now and November. Will Stevens be reelected as State House Speaker? I think so, but I'm not certain of that. And that's going to depend a lot upon the arm twisting that's going to be going on in the Republican caucus over the next 5 to 6 months, maybe even a little bit beyond that. Will the Democrats be able to hold on to these two competitive House seats? Marcy Kaptur has been a winner over and over and over again in situations where perhaps she was not the favorite for, to win that contest, but she's been very successful, very resilient. It'll be interesting to see how she does in 2024 against a pretty formidable candidate on the Republican side. Amelia Sykes probably will win that race as an incumbent, but again, there's a lot that could be determined between now and then that could affect that race. Will the independent redistricting commission amendment win a majority of the vote? I think it's likely to. I think Ohioans are tired of the games that are played with redistricting and would like to see some other way of doing this. Independent commissions are not perfect, but at least in my judgment, they're much better than the kind of thumb on the scale redistricting that is done by the politicians who have a real interest in what the result is going to be. And then what is the likely scenario for 2026? There are going to be very heated contests for the Republican nomination for governor between probably Husted and Yost, and there may be others as well who will toss their hat into the ring. A lot of money will be spent there. Husted's worry right now is that he could be tainted by this First Energy scandal and the $1 million that was sent in his direction when he was running for governor, 8 years ago? 8 years ago? No, 6 years ago, I guess. And, we'll just see what the effect of that is going to be. But there'll be politics going forward, as there always is. And I probably will have to change this talk somewhat even in the next 2 weeks if I'm giving it again. Well, let me stop at that point. I will be glad to address your questions. I didn't say answer them because I may not have answers for them, but I would be glad to hear them. Yes, go ahead. Okay, what she's asking is, given the ages of these two candidates and the fact that voters will look to their vice presidents as perhaps their immediate successors or their successors in 4 years, how much will that matter? And I guess the usual comment that would be made is that people don't vote for a vice president. Now, there's some exceptions to that. I think Jack Kennedy won the presidency in 1960 because Lyndon Johnson was on his ticket. There are other examples of that as well, but they're few and far between. What you're seeing already is that both sides are trying to identify who the likely vice presidential running mates are going to be. You've already seen a major attempt and a lot of money spent to try to diminish the stature of Kamala Harris by Republicans and Republican political action committees, with some success, by the way. I don't know who Trump is going to choose as his vice presidential running mate. I don't think anybody does right now. There are a number of people who would love to be that running mate, figuring that if he is reelected, they will be positioned to be his successor. If he decides to leave office after 4 years, that is. And so you'll see all that jostling going on. I think that we won't know really until the eve of the convention who his running mate is going to be. Could be J.D. Vance, or it could be somebody else, somebody we don't even know about right now. Okay, other questions? Yes, go ahead.
National polls flip and flop all the time. You see that. Back to your 7 swing states.
Mm-hmm.
How's the polling pick up independents in those states? Because I think it's going to come down to independents, but who's going to win these?
Yeah, it's very hard to pick up independents, and pollsters, even nationally, but certainly in the swing states, have a problem with how they actually ask the questions. Do you include the independents and the third-party candidates? Well, what if they really don't qualify for the ballot in that particular state? And so they tend to operate pretty conservatively in who they include, but it can matter. And what we've already seen in some of these states is that having Robert Kennedy Jr. on the ballot really matters. Because he draws, I think the latest one I saw was 16% of the vote, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. But it appears from that particular poll that he hurts Trump more than he hurts Biden, but he pulls voters from both of them. Now, I wanted to come back to that because the history of these independent and third-party candidates is that they can look pretty strong at this point of the campaign, and then their standing tends to go down over time. And the prime example of this is Ross Perot. When I used to mention him to my students, by the way, they're looking at me with this puzzled look. They'd never heard of Ross Perot. And then I would describe him. They would kind of perk up. They recognize the caricature of that particular candidate, though, again, they didn't know who he was. Ross Perot, at one point, right about now in the campaign, was running second, behind George H.W. Bush, who was in the high 30s, I think. Bill Clinton was running third in the 20s, and Perot was, I think, a bit above 30% in national polls. He ended up getting about 19% of the vote. You may recall, and most of you probably will recall this, that he dropped out and then re-entered the race later on. But by dropping out, he really, I think, kind of killed himself as a candidate. But he could have been a spoiler. It didn't turn out that way. Well, it probably did. I think Clinton wouldn't have won the presidency had it not been for Ross Perot being on the ballot. So the pollsters try to get this right, to get a good estimate. It's very hard for them to do it. Again, it's worth watching. Let me say it this way. As you get closer to the general election contest, the polls should be getting it right more often. On the other hand, there are going to be a lot of voters, because they don't like either candidate, who will be saying, well, I need to hold my nose and vote for one of them. And they don't quite know yet who that's going to be. And that's a very different kind of proposition than in a race for the presidency where the two candidates are fairly popular and fairly well liked. These two are just not. Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
What do you make of the role of the U.S. Supreme Court during this election season, primarily from their ducking the 14th Amendment claim that somebody who participates in an insurrection should be disqualified from running, or from the recent arguments over presidential immunity that looks like they're going to duck that one, or for the role of the court system in continuing Trump's trials ad infinitum, which would never be permitted for an ordinary citizen and certainly not for the chief executive, former chief executive, who's supposed to be the chief law enforcement officer of the country.
Okay, there are a lot of questions packed into that one question, but it's a really relevant question. I hesitate to predict anything in terms of what the courts are going to do. I think that what we're seeing right now is a lot of media commentators, very bright and learned people, trying to read signs on the Supreme Court. If a particular Supreme Court member, justice, raises an eyebrow, then they're thinking, well, that means that he or she is going to vote a particular way. I think we just don't know right now. The lower courts, I think, are more easily predictable because many of these are justices or judges who have been appointed by a particular president and have fairly consistent track records there. I don't know what the Supreme Court is going to do in the immunity case. Somebody was saying the other day in one of the news reports that I read was that Chief Justice Roberts looked really, really torn as he was listening to, I think it was Clarence Thomas, asking questions of one of the presenters, one of the lawyers there, and they were saying, well, maybe Roberts is going to be the swing justice there, and we don't know that. We just need to stay tuned there. Are they trying to slow things down? On the one hand, I can kind of understand that. To render a verdict that is negative or positive on a former president is a very difficult thing to do, unprecedented, really. And so I think they want to make sure they get it right. For the lower courts, they're always worried, of course, about an appeal. And they want to make sure that they are not making some kind of error in the way they handle the trial that is going to make an appeal easier. You saw the reversal of the Harvey Weinstein conviction in New York by a liberal court, but it was because of, in their judgment, there were errors committed in the way the judge ran that particular trial. It's not going to save him from jail because he already is jailed under California conviction. But nonetheless, they're going to be very, very careful here. We also are seeing how the judicial process works. There are all kinds of opportunities built in for delay. And if you have clever attorneys and are willing to spend a lot of money on those attorneys, you indeed can delay things long enough that you can get to the election itself, perhaps in the Trump case. And then if you're reelected, just quash all of these indictments and Justice Department action. So there's a lot going on here. I'm, by the way, of mixed minds as to whether I think that well, let me put it this way. Do voters deserve to know what the outcome of these various trials is going to be? On the one hand, I think yes. On the other hand, if it is an outcome that is either mixed across these various trials or one that vindicates ex-President Trump, then you could imagine that it could reelect him. And so, maybe it's better for those who are opposing Trump to just be patient and let this thing play out. Now, you wanted to follow up with something, yes.
Another real puzzle is why Georgia has not gone forward with their trial. That's a state crime that's being alleged.
Yes.
Not a federal one, so Trump can't pardon himself if he gets reelected.
Yeah, I think the problem, he asked why the Georgia trial has not shown more progress. And the truth is, I don't know the answer to that. But Fani Willis is under enormous pressure from both the state legislature and the governor to slow that down. And in fact, there, I think, is a bill that passed in the Georgia legislature to strip her of her prosecutorial powers. They haven't done that yet, but they could. And so I think she, again, is taking it slow. You want to make sure you have all the ducks in a row if you're prosecuting an ex-president, and that may be what she is doing. That trial could be moved forward next week. I just don't know the answer to that. But so far, President Trump, ex-President Trump, who has spent, I think by the latest counts, several $1 million to pay lawyers, and the money is there. He's taken it both from campaign funds and from the Republican National Committee. And also, they have asked candidates who are using the Trump name in their campaigns to give back 5% of the money they raise to the Trump Political Action Committee, not to the campaign, but to the Political Action Committee. And so he's got the funds to be able to hire lawyers that we couldn't hire to protect us from, in an indictment. And that's going to continue, obviously. And if you've got good lawyers, even lawyers who are not so good, they can easily slow down the process. And that's what's happening right now. You see little bits and pieces of things. I think now many of the, what do I want to call them, the grand jury records from the Florida case, the documents case, have now been released. And there are some really interesting things there. I think Judge Cannon didn't want to release them particularly and was fairly slow in doing so, but they are now out there and we'll continue seeing this throughout the course of the campaign. I'm reminded, and I tell my wife this all the time, don't get fixated on today's news because it's going to change tomorrow. Keep your blood pressure medicine close by on whatever side you're on, so that you can take it if you need to and don't have to take it if you don't need to. Okay, other questions, comments? Yes, go ahead.
What do you think it says about the state of our political process when the two candidates who are presented to the American voting population for not only the highest office in the land, but the most powerful position on the face of the planet, are both obviously well past their prime, and who many people feel when they're casting their vote feel as though they're choosing between the lesser of two evils. How do we get to a spot like that? What does it say about our system and our process?
Yeah, his question is, what is the fact that we have two aged candidates who are unpopular say about the democratic process as it's rolling out in the United States? My personal feeling is that it's not a good thing. One likes to have younger candidates. I'm now 80 years old, and while I would maybe like to be president, I wouldn't want to be president. I just can't imagine that. But it is what it is. And Biden, being the incumbent, was going to be renominated. Trump, being an incumbent from an earlier presidency, if he wanted it, was going to be renominated. By them being there, they prevent other candidates from emerging. Both the Democrats and the Republicans have erstwhile candidates who might make good presidents, but we're not going to be able to see them. And that, I think, is unfortunate in many ways. But again, it is what it is. You take the choices you have, even though they're not particularly attractive choices. The other thing I wanted to say is, and I think I started to say it but didn't finish it, is that the candidates going all the way back to 2012 have been among the most unpopular candidates we have seen running for the presidency on both sides. And I think that's a commentary on our times. We are in an era that is deeply polarized, where people on one side see people on the other side, even their neighbors and friends, as the enemy. And this is deeply unfortunate. In one of the talks I give, I've been involved for many years in a project that's called the Cross-National Election Project. And we do election surveys, national election surveys in other countries, but also in the United States. And we're now up to over 70 surveys in over 30 countries. And the United States is the winner in terms of the most polarization. Now, we don't have Israel among our countries, and I think if we were to do a survey in Israel, we would find that society deeply polarized politically, with an unpopular prime minister right now, but who's in power. And the only competitor to the U.S. in our surveys was Brazil, where you had the Bolsonaro presidency for was it 4 years? I think it was 4 years. Very unpopular, the Trump of Latin America, they called him. And that was a deeply polarized election, about as polarized as ours. And then the other one that is a bit more polarized than the United States is in Mozambique. Now, you've probably not paid much attention to Mozambique elections in recent years. The election that we surveyed was one that was held about a decade after a civil war in which several 100,000 people were killed. And the two major parties running for the top office in that country were the tribes that had waged the civil war against each other. And so there was really deep-seated feeling there, and indeed a feeling that the other side was the enemy. And there, I think they were 2% higher in polarization than the United States was in 2020, which was our last election poll here in this country. We're going to do another poll in 2024. My guess will be that we'll be even more deeply polarized as of 2024 than we have been. I think that is really unfortunate. It's a real problem for this country. It's a real problem when you see the other side as an enemy and you just can't stomach having them take power, and you're willing to do everything. Everything, I used to say short of violence. It's not short of violence necessarily. So yeah, it is a problem. One wishes it were otherwise, but it is what we have for 2024. Yes, go ahead.
Do you have suggestions as to dark money sources and amounts and ways of determining those, or at least getting a handle on it?
He's asking about how you can determine what kind of dark money is being invested in these campaigns. The best way to do it, and journalists are really good at trying to ferret out what the sources of dark money are. And the way they do it is not through the Federal Election Commission reports, because it's not reported there, or even the state reports, because it's often not reported there. What they look at are the annual reports of various corporations to see what money is being spent on what. And these are reports that these corporations have to issue. And they have to issue them to their stockholders and others, and they're public reports often. And you can kind of ferret out what's been going on there. One of the reasons that First Energy has gotten into so much trouble is that well after the fact, we have been able, or journalists have been able, to kind of dig into both emails, and one wonders, this is a footnote, one wonders why anybody would put anything into email that is illegal, but they do. And I remember when I was an department chair and a dean at Ohio State, the lawyers at Ohio State would say, don't put anything in email that you wouldn't want to have to admit to in a courtyard or in a courtroom. And so some of us learned that lesson, some really didn't. But anyway, First Energy executives didn't learn that lesson. And so there now are all these emails that are very compromising emails that could put some of those executives in jail. And that's how the journalists are able to ferret out what is going on with this dark money. But it's an imperfect process. It is one reason, by the way, why having an independent media is really important, because they are the other way that a window is opened on the political process, as imperfect as that is. And if that window is slammed shut, then we aren't going to know those things. And dictators around the world, by the way, recognize that full well, as did the Nazis in Germany and the fascists in Italy, is that one thing you want to do right away once you're in power is to try to silence the media, to make sure that a message that is an oppositional message doesn't get out. And we've seen some signs, attempted to do that in recent years as well here. Okay, yes, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Comment on what some of the polarization sources are, is it white supremacy, is it religion?
Say that a little bit more loudly.
Can you comment a little bit more on what the sources of the polarization in America, what some of them are?
Okay, there are a variety of things. One is, in very close elections, people perceive that the stakes are higher. The other side may get in, and it's easy to see them as the enemy. I quite frankly find it hard to believe that people could see Joe Biden as an enemy, but a lot of them do. And it's probably for policy reasons. They're worried about higher taxes, they're worried about a variety of things, more regulation. So that's one factor there. Another factor is, and again, I'm guilty of this, and you probably are also, is that we are much more inclined to talk about politics only with people with whom we agree. And that's not a good thing, necessarily. And so that, in a way, deepens the polarization. One thing I've done in the research that I've done from this Comparative National Election Project is look at discussion networks. Who do people talk to about politics? And are those discussion networks one-sided? And in this country, they are. And I think they are more and more. And I think all of you have probably been in situations either at the Thanksgiving dinner table where Uncle Harry is on the other side from you, whether liberal or conservative, but on the other side. And you're thinking, we don't want to get him riled up here, so we're going to talk about the Buckeyes, or we're going to talk about how the turkey is tasting, but we're not going to talk about politics. So that's one thing. We also were in an era of a movement away from broadcast journalism. Remember 3 channels? If you got 3 channels, where the news was pretty much the same and quite balanced. We now are in an era of narrowcasting and social media, where if you want to seek out a source that's going to reinforce your own views, you can easily find it. And so that reinforcement takes place, and it makes you even more certain that you're right on your side. And that's a factor as well. And I could go on and on. There are other things as well. We're in an era of you might even call it tribalism, where our social identities are writ large these days, and we are very eager to associate with people who are in our tribe and to think of the others as the enemy, basically. And that, I think, is very problematic for democracy. How democracies can survive with the level of polarization that we have right now is a big question. I'll add one other thing. One thing we've done, and I've done in the research that I've done, is take a look at how people are evaluating the top leaders in their country. And we use what's called a feeling thermometer. And it ranges from 0 degrees, where they're very cold towards that person, to 10, where they're very warm and like that person a lot. It turns out that a majority of Americans now see the person on their side in very positive terms, the person on the other side in very negative terms. A majority of Americans are now in that particular category. There are a lot of people in the middle, but when a majority are basically acting like team members, and they're going to support members of their team. So an endorsement from the leader of their team is really important in who they're going to vote for in an election. You know that you're in a situation that is probably untenable for the long run in terms of the health of democracy. Yes, go ahead.
How impactful do you think players outside the country are?
She's asking how impactful players outside the country are. They're very impactful. And what we know has been happening for many years, actually, has been the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, who else? What country am I missing? You're probably another country. Have been flooding the airways in this country with disinformation, trying to basically weaken democracy in the United States. In some cases to favor a particular candidate, in other cases just to create turmoil and chaos. And it's going on again this year. What is especially dangerous is when American officials pick up those themes and use them themselves, in some ways validating them. And we saw recently there were some Republican legislators who were very critical of fellow legislators because they were spouting the Russian line in terms of the propaganda. And that's a danger as well. One of the prices we pay, by the way, as an open society is that we are open to disinformation. And if you don't believe that, take a look at the social media and the kinds of things that are communicated via the social media. And other countries have whole offices that are devoted to basically creating disinformation, negative information that will try to stimulate polarization in the United States and weaken us, whether it's in terms of what we feel about providing aid to the Ukraine or the Israeli-Gaza situation. They are trying to capitalize on these kinds of issues. And so I think that they're a problem for us. And they're a problem for us, particularly if their messages are echoed by people who are officials in the United States. Yes, go ahead.
Back in the 70s, when I was a political science major in Florida, one of my professors told me that every 200 years or so, world power shifts. I don't know whether you believe that or agree with that or not, but do you see the things happening in the United States right now leading to something like that?
She's asking if I see a shift in what the forces in the world that might reduce U.S. power. I think that was your implication there. We are in an era right now where I think that authoritarianism is on the rise, not just here but elsewhere, and democracies are having trouble. Partly having trouble because it was difficult for them to deal with the recession and then the pandemic. And many of them were in power, the more democratic forces and parties. Whether it's a 200-year cycle, I'm not sure. I do know that in the United States, we have a fairly steady realignment cycle where the parties get redefined and the party balance gets redefined about every generation. So the Democratic Party today is no longer the New Deal Democratic Party from the 1930s and on. The Republican Party today is no longer the party of Ronald Reagan. It's a party that has been very much reformed or changed in a Trump MAGA direction in ways that I think a lot of Republicans are very uncomfortable with. And the question for them is, do they switch parties or just stop being active in the party? And it's a difficult question for them to deal with. So we, I think, are in a period of realignment and a period that indeed is going to change the nature of the two parties. Democrats now are likely to have a much larger educated base than they used to have, a much smaller white working class base than they used to have, a much smaller evangelical base than they used to have. Republicans have inherited more of the evangelical base that used to be in the Democratic Party, particularly in the South. They've inherited in Ohio and elsewhere more white working class, particularly males. They've inherited people with lesser levels of education. So there's been real change taking place there. It does two things. One is it changes the internal dynamics of the parties, who they listen to when they're formulating their own agendas. But it also changes, of course, the nature of inter-party politics and elections going to a general election itself. And we also see that the Republican Party right now is, I was going to say deeply divided. I'm not sure it is anymore. I think it really has become the party of a hostile takeover by Donald Trump. And he is really defining the party, and most Republican office holders have followed him for a variety of reasons that we could get into, but I won't propose to do that now. But it's really changed the nature of the Republican Party in ways that has forced many Republicans, I think Mitt Romney is a good example of that, mainstream Republicans or even Liz Cheney, who are kind of forced out of their party because they no longer are loyal enough to the powers that be within their party. And that change is going to impact us going forward, it seems to me. Yes, another question.
If something happened to Trump, do you think the Republican Party would be more moderate?
If something happened to Trump, would the Republican Party be more moderate? Well, electoral defeat, you would think, would make the party more moderate, but it didn't after 2020. Okay, if he passed away, or just decided, I don't want any more of this, I'm going to just run my business and stay out of politics. Not going to happen, but if it did. I think what's happened to the Republican Party is, and the economists have a term for this that I'm not remembering, but what you're seeing is a changing of the guard in who the Republican officials are. They are much more conservative, much more extreme here in Ohio and elsewhere than they have been in the past. What used to be called country club Republicans are now on the outs, largely. And it's a much more militant, extreme base in the Republican Party. And on the Democratic side, you see, I don't think the kind of extremism that you saw on the Republican side, but there still are people, and you see Biden is suffering from this right now in terms of opinion on the part of younger Democrats or younger liberals, that they're not happy with his Gaza policy. And so there's this pull in a more leftward direction that I think the Democrats have resisted more than the Republicans have, the pull in the more rightward direction. But those polls are there as well. So if Trump were to leave the scene, after 2024, I think you would have the politicians you're already seeing now who have been too supportive of Trump for them to easily go back. And of course, they're scared of the Trump base. They're afraid to alienate people. Some of them have made what I'll call Herculean efforts to change their positions. Ted Cruz comes to mind, Lindsey Graham comes to mind, whether they can reverse where they've been and go back to, Ted Cruz never was a moderate, but Lindsey Graham pretty much was. Whether they can do that again, who knows, and whether Donald Trump Jr. becomes the standard bearer after 2024, we will see. Okay, other questions? Yes, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead here.
Because you've been at OSU and the University of Michigan, I know that in the 60s at Michigan, there was a lot of students.
Yes, yes.
Very active. And Kenneth Bouldings set up the first in the country conflict resolution center. And his wife Elise became eventually a leader of peacemaking studies. And so I'm really interested in how can OSU perhaps create a curriculum that could give a certificate to students that would help them become active in both peacemaking or nonviolent alternatives, and also, you know, the things that are history and political, the things that you have been involved with. How could we create a certificate? I feel like we failed because we have been interested in sitting back and looking at what politicians are doing instead of.
Yeah, her question is, how do we try, as I guess university faculty and universities more generally, try to educate the next generation so that they are quite willing to be active in politics, but to be active in a constructive rather than a destructive fashion. I wish I knew the answer to that. I think it's harder these days to try to do that in the classroom, mainly because legislatures here and in other states as well are trying to control what goes on in the classroom more than they should be, in my judgment. And political science faculty, I think, are more exposed than probably anybody else to that. So it is a problem. We also, I think, are seeing, and you see it on the Ohio State campus right now and at other universities around the country, that it's much easier to mobilize students than it used to be, particularly because of social media. And there are causes out there that attract student interest. You know, the situation in both Israel and Gaza is one that on both sides creates real concern. And you can understand people, particularly young people, wanting to voice their concern over that. One hopes they don't carry it too far into violence, and I think haven't yet, but you never know. And of course, I'm of that generation. You know, I remember, I wasn't in Ohio at the time, but I remember Kent State. And there have been calls here in Ohio and in other states to mobilize the National Guard and bring them onto the college campuses. And you don't want to do that because the National Guard, you know, these are young kids themselves often, but they're armed. And you don't want to create a situation where you have a Kent State repeat. So we'll see. And of course, those kinds of demonstrations become fodder for the other side as well, and you're already seeing some signs of that. Politicians want to capitalize on what they see as a vulnerability on the part of, in this case, Joe Biden and you know, maybe other Democrats. Oh, I should add, by the way, that I've been, and I think I'm still a member of an organization that was founded here in Ohio for civility. And one of the members of that organization, and one of their favorites, was our current Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, and who looked pretty good to us at that time, not so much right now. And it's unfortunate because he, I think, also has been drawn into the fray in a way that he probably didn't want to be, but felt like he had to be able to be nominated for the U.S. Senate. Okay, another question.
Professor Beck, you have suggested that octogenarians are iffy candidates, but you yourself have disproven that by your knowledge and answers to questions today. So don't diss Biden because he's 81. Look at his heart. Look at his advisors and look what he's doing. But here's another point that's very serious. Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene have said because of the bad weather we see, earthquakes, tidal waves, it may be the end of the world. So in your opinion, will the election take place in November this year?
Well, again, several questions there. Will the election take place? Sometimes I wish it wouldn't, but I think it will. You know, will the Holocaust occur and we will no longer, or the apocalypse, I guess, occur? And Again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I don't think that's going to happen. I think we will muddle through as the climate gets worse, but muddle through nonetheless. Am I ready to be president? I don't really think so. But write me in if you want to. Okay, I think we probably, Mary, go ahead if you have a question.
Yeah, since you've been on the college campus fairly recently, student turnout, at least I know in Ohio, has decreased in the last 10 years significantly. And last year's change of voting ID laws have made it harder for students to vote. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, her question is, do I have any thoughts about the decrease in student turnout? It's been the case in recent years in Ohio and elsewhere that Republicans in particular have wanted to try to reduce student turnout because students on college campuses were easily mobilizable and they were voting Democratic. Had they been voting Republican, it would have been probably the Democrats who tried to do that, although I don't really think so. I'm reminded of my days in Ann Arbor a long time ago, when if you were a student on the Michigan campus and you came from outside of Washtenaw County, you could not vote in local elections, even if you were registered to vote in Michigan, but it was hard to do then. And then there was a state Supreme Court decision that the state could not bar registration for people who had come from out of state and had lived in Michigan for, I think, a year. And all of a sudden, the student vote elected a new city council in Ann Arbor that immediately legalized marijuana. And I think it didn't last. I had left Michigan by the time they had done the legalization. But you can understand the fear of having students vote. And it's there. It's harder, I think, for students these days to vote in Ohio as well as many other states because there are too many barriers in front of you. And you can vote absentee at home, but if you're from out of state, then you have to go through the rigmarole to cast an absentee ballot. And that's not always easy to do. It depends on the state. Okay, well, I think it's 3 o'clock. I'm told that this is the time. Yes, you have one last question. We can sneak it in.
Based on the polls today, what's going to happen?
Well, based on the polls today, Trump would win the presidency. Now, again, it's early. And the polls may change over time. We don't know that for sure. They haven't changed a lot in the last few months. And you keep thinking that various indictments and court cases are going to reduce the Trump base. And the base is now, by my estimates, probably 40% of the electorate. That's not enough to win the presidency. But if Biden can't claim independence and people are kind of in the middle, or if he splits them with Trump, Trump quite well could win the presidency. And the polls in some of these battleground states are showing Trump being ahead. But again, it's early. And I'm always reminded when I look at these polls not to believe them, just to wait. Because I think a lot of voters, let me put it a different way. If you're faced with a choice between unattractive alternatives, what you typically do if you're like me is you postpone the decision, right? You don't want to have to, if you don't have to make the decision right now, you don't do it. And so I can imagine that as we get closer to the election, many more people are going to decide, well, okay, I've got to take my pick between the two. And how that's going to go, I don't really know. But it could well be that they would vote for an incumbent president over an ex-president, or it could be that they will blame the incumbent president for things that they don't like about what's going on. We'll just have to wait and see. So I think it's very much up in the air. I wish I were better at predicting. I've usually been wrong when I make predictions in close contests, so who knows what's going to happen. Okay, well, I thank you very much.